Welcome to Brew Kombucha. Today I'm gonna go over what to do if you've just received a kombucha SCOBY. So if you've just received a kombucha SCOBY, whether you've purchased one or if you've just received one from a friend, I'm gonna walk you through what to do, how to store it, and what to do with it until you're ready to brew with it. So if it's in a plastic container and you're planning on brewing with it in the next few days or so, you don't need to worry about it. You can just leave it in that plastic container until you are ready to brew with it. If you're not sure when you're going to have the opportunity to brew your first batch of kombucha, then I recommend just taking it out of that plastic container and putting it into a clean container, preferably made out of glass. That way you can keep the liquid and the kombucha SCOBY in something that won't rip or tear or and that is in something that's food safe. So there's that fun kombucha SCOBY in its new home. And what you can do is just cover that with a tight weave cotton cloth just to keep any insects or dust particles out. Secure it with the rubber band and then just keep it at room temperature until you're ready to brew with it. It will smell acidic, most likely, and that's totally okay. It will continue to acidify as it sits at room temperature, and that's perfectly fine. The more acidic that starter tea gets, the better it is for your brew, because that means it will acidify your first batch of kombucha even faster and make it less susceptible to harmful pathogens and to mold. If your kombucha SCOBY came with around a cup of starter tea, then you're all set and you don't need to add anything to it. Hopefully they gave you a good amount of that starter tea, because the starter tea is actually way more important than the physical SCOBY mat or the pellicle itself. I talk about this in a lot of my other videos, but SCOBY is actually a term that stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And in actuality, that symbiotic culture lives within the starter liquid just as much as it lives within the pellicle or the physical SCOBY mat. I won't say that the SCOBY mat is completely useless, because I have found that adding starter tea in conjunction with a physical pellicle does speed up fermentation. But in any case, if you have both the starter tea and the physical SCOBY mat or the pellicle, you're in good shape. If you don't have enough starter tea, say it only came with about a 1/4 cup of liquid along with your physical SCOBY mat, you might want to add about a cup of sweet tea just to give it some food and let it ferment before you start brewing a larger batch of kombucha. And even though that 1/4 cup might be really acidic, in my opinion, I don't think a 1/4 cup of acidic starter tea is enough to safeguard most kombucha batches from mold. And so you might see a lot of supposedly reputable online retailers tell you to add some distilled white vinegar to your brew. And I have a whole other series of videos that explain why I think white vinegar is unnecessary for the kombucha brewing process. And so what I prefer to do is I just take that small amount of starter tea, add some sweet tea to it to basically acidify that sweet tea. Let that ferment for a few days until that sweet tea becomes acidified, and then use that as the starter tea for your larger batch of kombucha. So if you receive less than a cup of starter tea with your kombucha SCOBY, what I recommend doing is just taking a cup of hot water, adding either 1 black tea bag or a teaspoon of loose leaf black tea and a tablespoon of sugar, and letting that steep. Strain the tea leaves out, let it come to room temperature, and then add it to your starter tea. Let that sit in the jar for a few days to a week until it starts smelling and tasting really acidic, and then use that as starter tea to make a larger batch of kombucha. If you look at the resources on my website and other videos and my other videos here on YouTube, you'll find that my basic kombucha recipe for 1 gallon of kombucha calls for 2 cups of starter tea. So if you only have 1 cup, or if you have less starter tea than what I call for in my basic gallon batch, you can have my recipe, you can quarter it to accommodate for how much starter tea you do actually have. And another tip that I like to tell first-time homebrewers is, if you don't have enough starter tea, you can always go to the store and find some raw, unflavored kombucha from a reputable source. Local is always better, but there are also some national commercial chains that are pretty readily available. As long as it's unflavored, you can use that kombucha to bump up the amount of starter tea you have for your first batch of kombucha. Starter tea is basically just another word for a batch of kombucha that has successfully undergone first fermentation. So as long as it's unflavored, kombucha basically equals starter tea. So whenever you are ready to brew with that starter tea and that SCOBY, go ahead and follow the instructions that I outline on my website and here on my YouTube channel. I have a quick start guide to first fermentation that'll walk you through the recipe and all the steps and all the questions that you might have around brewing kombucha for the first time. I have a ton of resources and tips at my website, youbrewkombucha.com. As always, happy brewing!